It's time to accelerate. Hi, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Join me as I host conversations with the leading experts in sales, marketing, sales automation, sales process, leadership, management, training, coaching, any resource that I believe to help you accelerate the growth of your sales, your business, and most importantly, you. Hello, and welcome to Accelerate. Joining me on the show today is Keith Dugdale. He's CEO of The Business of Trust, which is a sales consultancy based in Brisbane, Australia. And we've had a lot of really interesting guests come from Australia on the sales side, a lot of good sales thinking going on there. An author of a book called Smarter Selling, which we're going to talk about on the show. Keith, welcome to Accelerate.
Thank you very much, Andy. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, pleasure to have you. So, I was serious. We've had some really interesting guests, and I urge anybody that's listening to go back and check some of them out with Tony Hughes, John Smybert, Kean McLaughlin, Peter Strokorb, a few others. Said some people doing some really good leading edge thinking about sales in Australia, of which yours was one as well.
Yeah, they're all, well, actually, I think every name you've mentioned there is part of a group that we've pulled together here to keep on challenging each other's thinking, I guess, in this space.
Excellent. Well, you're doing a good job of it. So maybe fill in my introduction a little bit and tell people how you got your start in sales.
I'd worked with PwC and the consulting businesses for years around the world. And over time, primarily in business development and in actually training roles. And over time, you start to see the patterns between those who are really good at their client relationships and also making serious revenue and those who aren't. But frustrated by the pattern of someone saying, I'll just go and do what Jane does. But of course, you can't unpick what Jane does because Jane just does it. And so my mate and I, David, who's based in Hong Kong at the time with PwC, set up a business to try and code the behavior. And the book, we started running programs before the book. And then people started saying, you really should get a book on this stuff because at that stage it was very different. And so the book got written. We were very fortunate to get one of the best publishers in that space. And the rest, as they say, is history. We've now run consulting in, I think it's 27 countries, and have a lot of fun with a lot of great clients.
Well, excellent. So business is called The Business of Trust. So do you focus primarily on building trust-based relationships in business and how to expedite, sort of along the lines of the speed of trust, facilitate economic relationships through trust?
Absolutely. So for us, the end game has been, well, both the end game and the start game. It is if you focus on helping a client succeed rather than selling something, and you help build the trust through helping them succeed, then they will buy from you. So if you want to kind of put two sides of the coin, as opposed to selling something, it's creating an environment where they want to buy from you. Yeah,
and you talk about this in your book. You define that really as the IOU approach, which is spelled out IOWEU approach to selling. Yep. So, may I explain that just a little bit further for the people listening?
Yeah, the whole notion is that if you think about the way that many salespeople behave, they take control. So it's almost as if they, the customer actually owes them. Whereas what we're trying to do is to get salespeople into that mindset that I, as the salesperson, owe you, as the customer, everything. Because you're already committing to me your time, and at some point you might commit to me your money. So at the moment, the onus is on me as a salesperson to give you as much value through the sales interaction as I possibly can.
And you say that actually to the extent that you can actually create a buying experience that the buyer enjoys.
Absolutely. And I mean, I guess we all know it. When we are the customer, we know that we go back to places to buy things when we enjoy the experience. And yet it's kind of strange that a lot of salespeople and sales organizations don't create that experience for their customer when they're selling. And yet, if you look at some of the research by the Challenger guys, if you look at their original research, now I think it was something like 42% of repeat purchases were based nothing to do with the price of the product or the product itself. It was totally and utterly based on, did I get value and enjoy the interaction with the salesperson?
Yeah.
And yet, at that point, there's very little training around making sure your customer gets value out of the interaction. It was pushing how much they're going to enjoy the thing they purchased. Yeah.
Well, yeah. If you think about all this, the field about customer experience, it really starts after the sale, for the most part.
Yeah, and what we're saying. So a lot of our clients, we've got some in traditional retail, some very large ones in traditional retail, but a lot of our clients tend to be in the professional services, where if you like to say expert industries, where the salesperson, although they probably wouldn't call themselves a salesperson, focuses on showing that they are the best lawyer in town or the best accountant or engineer or whatever it is. And frankly, the person on the other side doesn't really. They kind of assume that that's a given that you know how to build a bridge.
Well, that's why they're talking to you.
Exactly. That gets your foot in the door. But what we're trying to get people to do is to say, okay, especially where technology is going, so you can get knowledge on technology, but also the increasing competition across all spheres. So I've now got, even within Australia now, I've got one of the big four accounting firms competing directly with a small company who up until a few years ago sold TVs. And so what they're both trying to do is recognize at the end of the day, they need to build a much more trusted relationship with the critical decision makers in the customer organizations that then facilitates buying their gear at some point, whether that gear is legal advice or technology to help their business run more efficiently.
So I'm curious, what is the big four accounting firm competing against the company that used to sell TVs? What piece of business are they competing for?
It's a great question, Andy, and I think this is an area that I'm not sure most organizations have really got their head around, especially at the top end. If you're dealing with the top end of any organization, be they a small corner shop or a big bank, when you're dealing with the top executives, to them, their time is more valuable than their money. Mm-hmm. And so, the CFO of an organization, for example, only has, let's give him the benefit of the doubt, 10 hours a day. And I've interviewed a few of these around the world, at the top end of town, and they're very clear. I will give my time to the person who gives me most return for that time. So if I can sit down with one of the consultants from the company that sold technology, or with one of the partners from a big accounting firm, and I have to make a decision which one I give an hour to, I will give my hour to the person who gives me most return for that hour.
Yeah.
And so what we would genuinely to both of those two people say, right, so how are you going to focus on giving the most value to that person? Well, talk about my stuff. No. You need to find out what is going on for that person in their world, regardless of what your product is. And so in theory, both the people going to speak to that person, once they've done their research, and we talk about different ways you can do research, as pest analysis or our own Focus 5, you start to get patterns of what is important to that CFO. And the person that CFO will see is the one who believes, based on the introductory email, for example, inviting the meeting, yeah, that's really important to me. That's going to be a really valuable meeting in my world.
Yeah, which requires a degree of research into the prospect before you send that email.
It requires into the prospect, absolutely. But I think, again, here there's a slight shift. If I work with a lot of sales organizations, the research they'll do about their prospects is usually about the prospect organization, and to a certain extent about the individual, and they've got LinkedIn and the like that you can use. What we would say is you've actually got to look at four things. You need to look at the person you're speaking to, what sort of person they are, what their drivers are, their bonus systems, their relationships internally, the role they have, the business function they sit in, how is that seen politically, what are their budgets like, the organization, but probably as important as any of the others is actually the industry they sit in. So, and I'll just give you a very quick example. So imagine both of these people are trying to build a relationship with someone high up in a bank. What will almost certainly fall out of doing analysis around the industry is there are issues going on for CFOs in banks in Australia that CFOs in banks in the US have already addressed. So the onus then becomes go and find out what those banks in the States did in a similar situation. Don't pretend to be an expert in that, but take that knowledge to this person in the bank in Australia. That is immensely valuable. Mm-hmm. And then you build that trust. Now, of course, you can't afford to do this across the whole business community. So the sales organization has to have a very, very tight key account strategy, knowing who their targets are, who their relationships need to be with, and then do it within that.
So, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, so you're almost flipping the model on its head. So it's rather than saying, I've got this solution and I need to find a problem that fits it. And you know where I'm going on that.
Yeah.
It's kind of flipping that over and saying, actually, no, I know who the clients are I need to have, and I probably need to have a long horizon for that. Let me figure out how I can build relationships at the top there by genuinely adding value to them in every interaction. And Jack Welch had a very similar thinking. You know, he was well known within the GE world for roping. If he met someone on the way out of the building, he said, I'm just going to catch up with John for a cup of coffee. He'd drag them back in and said, no. What's the value in John and having a cup of coffee with them unless there's something else? Mm-hmm. So you know, it's a different approach. But and I don't know in the States how what the situation is with this, but one of the basic challenges a lot of organizations we see here and also in Europe faces, they actually don't have a really good key account strategy. So they don't know which clients they want to have 3 years down the track. They don't know who the key players are in those accounts. What they have is an opportunity prospecting strategy, which is very different.
Oh yeah, well, I'm laughing because I just before I was speaking with you, I was talking to someone else for another interview, and that was a point that was being made exactly, is that there seems to be a problem of really short horizon in sales planning and business planning, if you will, for sales in too many sales organizations.
Yeah, and you know, I'm surprised if usually what triggers more discipline and all of that is a downturn. So in Australia, we've had a boom economy for 24 years. Late 2012, the mines turned the taps off because China needed less stuff out there. So I can understand why there's not much discipline in the systems, and that part of that discipline is having a key account strategy, following through a strong go, no-go process, all that kind of stuff. In the States, where you kind of hit that tsunami in 2007, you'd have thought that would have triggered in most companies at least over probably a 2 or 3 year period an aha moment as to, we really need to get this right. And what's also we're finding here, and I'd be really interested to find out in your neck of the woods what the situation is. One of the challenges we've got here is the sales managers who are running the sales teams all came through a boom economy. So what they're actually coaching the sales team in is actually poor behavior designed for an older age.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's lots of issues, right, that people confront these days. But I think one of the solutions that we're seeing here, and I think it's spreading to Australia as well, is moving to this notion of account-based selling, account-based marketing, account-based selling, which is much more strategic at the top level because you are finding those accounts that are going to have the long-term value that you can provide to them. There'll be a long-term value on both sides, and then targeting it with a different sales approach that is about building relationships through a broader segment of contacts within the company, as opposed to just sort of trying to find that one person that can open the door for us.
Absolutely.
And so, I think relationships for the companies that are embracing that and beginning to practice it, then relationships and the relationship capital as you talk about it, it starts becoming a little bit more important.
It does, and I'm finally hearing out, actually in a conversation yesterday with someone in Perth, and they're saying they're finally finding that the CRM systems, the technology side of things, is getting much better at helping with that relationship capital side of things. Because most CRMs are typically driven by the product and the account, but not by the human beings behind the account.
Yeah, I think they're...
And also not by the human beings in the sales organization. So as soon as your system can make all those connections, it makes it easier to drive a relationship strategy.
Well, I think it becomes sort of the final platform that other tools are using to help put that information into the CRM system to make it more useful. So it's more of a platform play. But to your point in your book is, so you're saying, hey, that relationships, and yet so much of selling, especially in inside sales, is about I've got my team of cadre of inside salespeople, and we're just trying to set up meetings for account execs and so on, which isn't about relationships at all. And so there's going to be
there's going to be an evolution, I think, that's going to occur in this. That's going to be really critical as it gets harder and harder to sustain growth using sort of the conventional inside sales model that a lot of companies use today. So to a point that you make in your book is that unfortunately a lot of sales training doesn't really, even though it says it talks about relationships, it doesn't really train people how to build relationships.
No, it doesn't, because again, I think that what we're talking about is a very behavioral issue, and for anyone to change behavior from whatever it was to whatever you want it to be is a massive thing. And yet very few sales organizations, I think, when they come to choose their training provider, look at the whole behavior. So we find ourselves probably as much now telling potential clients to not proceed with training because there are an awful lot of other dominoes they need to line up before they go near it if they want to make it effective.
So what's the first domino they have to line up?
Well, the first is the stuff we've been talking about is
behavior
firstly,
change.
have a business strategy.
Right.
That'd be a nice thing. Have a key account strategy that everyone believes in.
Mm-hmm.
Have identified long-term market share and revenue goals, and then identify who the really key players are, as well as those, the technical buyers further down the chain, but the really key players are in there. And then determine who from your organization needs to build those relationships before you go near anything. And then at the back end of it, before you start the training, make sure you have all your infrastructure in place to embed the learning, coaches, technologies, et cetera, et cetera. Have your KPIs aligned, your promotion systems aligned. Have your CRM aligned. There's one firm over here, I remember years ago, started working with us and at the same time brought in a tool that did nothing but measure pipeline. And I went to the leaders and I said, you got two conflicting messages here, and I know which one's going to win. And sure enough, they then built a reputation over years of having the best forward book in their industry. But none of it was profit-making or real, because all any what people were doing they knew they were going to be judged on the pipeline. So let's fill the pipeline.
Sure.
It wasn't real, but it was there. And so getting all of those pieces aligned, and then you say, right, now you're ready to go. And let's not call this training in the middle, shall we? Let's call it something different. Let's call it something to do with empowering your strategy. And let's make this internal, not external. So you call it whatever you want to call it. So it becomes part of your ether in your organization, not this external mob running in with a training course and just with a long tail who'll keep on taking money off you. Just make this part of the way you do things. And what we're seeing in every market, and this isn't down to us, but every market we go to and every industry we go to, things are pretty tough here in Australia at the moment. But in every market, there's one or two outliers who are making extraordinary profits, and yet all their competition is really struggling. And when you get down underneath the sheets to find out what it is they've really got a culture in their organization, across the organization, from new graduate right to the top of the tree. We are here to build relationships in the marketplace. That's our job. Yeah, we still got to sell stuff.
So, I mean, your book may be one of the only sales books I've read that quotes Carl Jung. And that leads off a chapter about understanding how the customer really sees you, which is such a critical element of this, about perception. So, what are the sort of key steps you take to shape these perceptions?
Okay, so I'll just give you a couple of really simple examples. I think anyone listening to this will be able to affiliate to. One of the first things a lot of salespeople say in a meeting with a new prospect is, so what is your biggest challenge? Okay, and it's intended as a really good question. Okay, it's intended as a really good question. In those behaviors we talk about 8 different behaviors. So one of those is opportunity fear. So on one end of the scale, you believe very high opportunity score means you believe everything's all going to work out. It's great, life's great, it'll be fantastic. Yeah. Other end of the scale, incredibly risk averse, negative thinking, fear driven. That question, what's your biggest challenge, works really well for someone who likes the fear side of things, because that's the world they live in. Most CEOs...
You're saying a great question for the sales rep or for the customer, for the buyer?
The sales rep asks it. It's a great question for a customer who sits at that low end of the scale, because they're comfortable with challenge and negative. most CEOs around are actually the opposite end of the scale. So they live in a world of opportunity. That's why they are the CEO. They have to look forward. Someone of that type, hearing what's your biggest challenge, and I can say this very personally, we score at 180, I score 160 in opportunity. The first time someone says to me, what's your biggest challenge? I genuinely, every fiber of my body wants that person gone, because they're trying to take me to a dark world I do not like being in. Why do I want to spend time with someone like that? So it's the salesperson needs to understand that is their tendency, is to go into that negative. They need to ask a couple of questions that start the conversation with me or with someone like me, that they realize, this is a guy who lives in a positive world. I need to change that question around. And so they might ask me, instead of what's your biggest challenge, they might say, how's business going? I'll say, fantastic. They say, what's going best? I'll say this. They say, of all those things that are going really well, could any go any better? Absolutely. But they're not dragging me into that negative world.
Well, and this is really interesting, because I'm a huge believer and advocate for, I hate the question, what's your pain point? And I think it's a useless question in the most cases, because again, as you said, CEOs, and not just CEOs, people that have responsibility for a certain outcome are thinking about a more aspirational level, not a pain avoidance level.
Absolutely, and it was really interesting. I've been doing some interviews of my own for some stuff we're doing, and I did 2 yesterday for people who've been through our material years ago, actually, and both of them said one of the most impactful things that have changed the way that they interact with their clients in the first ever meeting, and also the impact it's had on their revenues and their careers, is when they ask one of those ridiculously aspirational questions right at the start. And I'll just give you an example of quite a brave one. This is a female engineer. And she says she now starts nearly every meeting with a question that's quite similar, which is along the lines of, so imagine it's 10 or 20 years down the track. What do you want to be telling your grandchildren about that building you're about to build? That's awesome.
That's a great question. I love it.
And she says that she's convinced the reason she has such incredible success with it is everyone else who goes and meets these clients is going, so what's your pain point? What's your biggest challenge? How demotivational is that?
Well, a simple example, a way to talk about aspirations is sort of the same thing as say, okay, well, where do you want to be, let's say 3 years from now, and where are you today? And suddenly,
absolutely,
you don't even have to ask the next question, because the customer will ask it for you. They'll say, okay, well, here's this gap between where we want to be and where we are. That's the issue, right?
And we're exactly on the same page here, Andy. And for me, the interesting thing is, as soon as you So that 3-year question, so the 3-year horizon, the 5-year horizon is brilliant, and you can ask that very early in any conversation. The reason why most people, not just salespeople, don't ask it is partly they haven't thought about it, but partly they have no idea what the answer is going to be. And that's why it's a great question. But that's actually quite terrifying to the salesperson. Because, oh God, what if they start talking about stuff that I don't know anything about?
Yeah, but instead of saying, which I always did in those environments, is like, oh, cool. I learned something new, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
To me, that was why I was in sales in the first place.
Absolutely, Andy. And so for me, and I think it'd be quite interesting. I don't know how you do any research on this. I think one of the things that we've kind of drummed out of people is curiosity.
Yes.
I love, I can remember just being fascinated by a guy I met in Shanghai when I lived there. And he said, yeah, what I do is I'll make, those video cassettes? I said, yeah. He said, the black flap at the front? I said, yeah. And he said, inside that black flap, there's a tiny little piece of metal. There's a spring. I said, yeah. He said, that's what I make. And I make a lot of them. But once people, and again, I think the higher up you get up organizations, the more they want to talk about their business.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
So don't pretend to know more than you do. You'll never know more than your client does about their own business. But
I think that's because part of the issue is we've become so scripted in many cases.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes the scripts, there's a tendency for organizations to, not all, but some, to say, well, we've laid out the playbook, we've got the script, we're going to train our people to the script. But I'd rather say, God, I want to train my people to understand the customer and forget the script. If they understand the customer and their business, then they'll ask this question and they will be prepared for the answer, even if they've never heard it before, because they understand the business. They'll be able to come up with a good follow-on question.
Yeah, but I think, Andy, that one of the, and I know this, I've worked with a very large organization out of Boston, as well as in a number of different parts of the world. What a lot of organizations, even when they get their head in their space about, and they get really into, this is what we need our sales team to be doing, absolutely wrestle to find people who are good at it. And I think we're actually rallying against an education system here, because certainly over here in the UK, my background, the education system is almost by rote. And those who succeed in the education system are not those who are used to asking good questions. Those used to giving detailed answers. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so if you, from the age of 4 or 5, you've just become really good at giving answers, the chance of you suddenly at the age of 35 or 40 being able to flip that round, you can do it, but it's a long stretch for a lot of people. And we're finding in most sales organizations now, there's probably 10 or 20% who are doing it naturally anyway. Mm-hmm. There's probably 10 or 20% at the bottom who will never get there. Either they can't or they don't want to. Right. And then there's a whole batch in the middle who can, but it's going to take a lot of work. And that's why I said earlier, it's so critical that the organization has all their other pieces aligned around the behavior they really want, and don't just hope the behavior is going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, is if you're undertaking an initiative in behavior change, which is behavior change, we're talking about the fundamental behaviors of sales, they don't take place in a vacuum. They take place as part of a process or a structure, as you talked about. And so once they're ready to implement and practice and hopefully inculcate those behaviors into a habit, then they've got a system in which to use it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Interesting. Yeah, I love that point about the opportunities versus pain. And then when you talk about trust as well as one of your core behaviors, you have this tool you call an octagon. You talked about your score on your octagon score, which you can tell people in a few minutes where they can find out more about that. But you have sort of a less conventional view of trust. I mean, you're talking about trust really about, as a salesperson, ceding control, which is tough for them.
It is tough for them because, especially when all they're in.
Not that they have any control to begin with. They have the illusion of control.
Absolutely. Then they try and take it. And if you look at a lot of Rackham's work, the whole
spin selling.
And he says this himself. Yeah, he says it himself that the architecture he designed in those days was designed around selling Xerox photocopiers in a day when the salesperson could take control because the customer didn't know any better.
Well, they didn't have they didn't have an alternative place to go.
Well, yeah, absolutely. If you go back, maybe it's probably about 15 years ago, he said that architecture is long gone because the customer now has all control, and increasingly so with technology and the like. But a lot of sales systems and methodologies, as I said earlier, they're kind of talking about relationship, but essentially they're still a solution looking for a problem that fits. The trust for us is, and Meister, David Meister's stuff in the Trust Advisor is absolutely spot on as far as we're concerned. His trust equation, I think it would be a really nice, simple tool for most salespeople to ask their customers is, please score me on these 4 different variables. And what the customer will nearly always say is high on credibility, moderate on reliability. What do you mean by intimacy? And really high on self-orientation, because the salesperson goes in there and takes control. And what Meister says and we're saying is, no, trust and control are opposite sides of the same coin. And the analogy I make, which is kind of trite, but people hopefully will understand what I say. When I get back from a business trip, if I walk up to my wife and say, honey, do you fancy going out for a Chinese meal tonight? I'm taking control. If you look at the Honey and Mumford research way back in the 70s, I think they said it's something like an 80-odd% chance that my wife will rebut me in one way or another. Now, she's not rebutting the fact that she doesn't want Chinese. She's rebutting the fact that I've taken control. Mm-hmm. Whereas if instead when I get home, I say to her, what do you fancy doing tonight? I think there's something like a 60% chance that she will say, I don't know, what do you fancy? And that's that dynamic of me giving her control by asking her what she wants, and immediately she reciprocates by giving it back to me. because she doesn't feel controlled. You know, I don't know about you, Andy, but I know very few people who like to be sold to, but I know an awful lot of people who like to buy things.
Mm-hmm.
The reason we don't like to be sold to is the salesperson's taking control of us.
That's very interesting.
Once they stop, yeah. So it is simple in concept, but actually in execution for a salesperson, it can be quite hard. Especially when sitting behind them is all these systems pressurizing them on how many calls to make, what their numbers are, and all this thing. And so what we're saying in that world is incredibly counterintuitive. And that's why I go back to what I said earlier. You have to have a strategy that cuts down the number of calls, the number of meetings, the number of organizations and people you need to contact, spend more time on fewer, and you'll get a much greater success rate.
Oh, I agree 100%. And also, if you have to take the fear out of it. I mean, the control comes from fear.
Yeah.
Right? The salesperson wants to be in control because they're afraid that if they're not in control, then, it's not going to turn into an opportunity. They think
absolutely.
Yeah, and they've been taught over time that the only way to make things happen is to be in control. I mean, you can Google controlling the sales process, and I talk about this in one of my books, and you get 31 million returns. It's like, yeah, for something that's a complete illusion. I mean, you're never in control. So,
no.
Yeah, very interesting. Keith, we get into the last segment of the show here, and I've got some standard questions I ask all my guests. And the first one is actually a hypothetical scenario. And in this hypothetical scenario, you, Keith, have just been hired as the new vice president of sales for a company whose sales have stalled out. Time to hit the reset button. CEO, the board, very anxious for sales to get back on track. So what 2 steps could you take your first week on the job that could have the biggest impact?
Wow. First 2 steps. The 2 things I'd want to achieve really quickly is assess the sales force and assess everything else in the organization that supports and drives that sales force behavior. There's a third one that I'd really want to get in as well if I was going to be naughty, and that would be to understand the customer's perceptions of our view of reality.
Okay. Love the way you phrase that. All right. Well, that's a good answer. Very succinct. So now I've got some more rapid fire questions. You can give me 1-word answers if you wish or elaborate. The first one is when you, Keith, are out selling your services, what's your most powerful sales attribute?
Curiosity.
Who's your sales role model?
Sales role model. Actually, it's someone. He's not someone in the public domain. He's a guy called Alan Ross, who was my mentor for years in Asia.
Okay. What's besides your own? What's one book every salesperson should read?
Challenger.
Which one? Sale or customer?
Customer.
I agree. I think that's a better book. All right, last question for you. Always a tough one for people. What music is on your playlist these days?
Oh my God, I haven't moved since 1977.
All right,
I wish you were here. Bat Out of Hell, Rumor.
Bat Out of Hell, okay. Rumor, okay. Gosh, got some classics there. So Fleetwood Mac, Meatloaf. All right, good stuff.
Yeah, some Floyd in there.
Pink Floyd, excellent. Nothing wrong with that at all. All right, well, Keith, I want to thank you for joining us today. Tell folks how they can connect with you and learn more about what you do.
Excellent. How do they connect with me? If they go to www.boft.com, they'll get links to all the LinkedIn and blogs and newsletters we do. If they're interested in the profiling tool, the links are in there as well, or they can just go to onlineoctagon.com. It's free, doesn't cost anything, but all the information's there. Those are probably the 2 best contact points. We're about to actually roll out an online learning program, which we're really excited and I guess nervous is the fair thing to say.
Well, people listening, they'll hopefully go and get in touch and learn more about that. So again, thank you for being on the show. And friends, thank you for taking time out of your day to listen to Accelerate. And remember, make it a part of your daily routine to deliberately learn something new every day to help you accelerate your success. And easy way to do that is take a minute and subscribe to this podcast, Accelerate. That way you won't miss any of my conversations with top business experts like my guest today, Keith Dugdale, who shared his experience about how to accelerate the growth of your business. So thanks for joining me. And until next time, this is Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you like what you heard and want to make sure you don't miss any upcoming episodes, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher.com. For more information about today's guest, visit my website at andypaul.com.